every individual is a leader in some form or fashion.
Actually, a pleasure to be connecting with you finally, Mukund, after many months, and very, very happy to be inviting and welcoming you on this series, which is called Insightful Leadership Conversations. And after reading your book, The Brand Custodian, it's been on my mind that I should definitely host you as one of my guests. So thank you so much for that very insightful book. And so well written, so articulate, and absolutely full of information. So welcome to this journey of about an hour in which we will converse on multiple topics with particular reference to brand as you have seen and experienced it.
Sure. Thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you. So, Mukund, your book, The Brand Custodian, was an eye-opener for me in terms of leaders as brand custodians. And what are your thoughts on it?
So maybe I should first explain how I came to be appointed as a brand custodian, because I must confess it wasn't a term that I was familiar with. I was, in fact, the first brand custodian of the Tata Group.
Yeah.
And before I was appointed, there was no such role.
Okay.
So what really happened was, I was summoned to the office of our then deputy chairman, soon to become chairman of the Tata Group, Cyrus Mistry. And Cyrus was aware that I had earlier in my career in Tata's worked with Ratan Tata for 12 years. And he also knew that I'd then gone on to lead a telecom company. I was subsequently overseeing private equity at Tata Capital. I'd done some interesting things, and he was trying to build a new generation of leadership in the Tata Group. So he said, I've heard good things about you and the time you've spent in the group, and the fact that you work very closely with Mr. Tata has also been an important consideration in what I have in mind, which is really to invite you to become part of this new group executive council in the Tatas, the next generation of leadership for the Tata Group, if you will. And the role I'd like you to play is that of the brand custodian.
Wow.
I said, well, what on earth would a brand custodian do? And he said, well, obviously you would have responsibility for the Tata corporate brand and the way it needs to be presented in India and overseas. Tata's obviously had become a very international group by the time he was taking over. You will therefore also be the person communicating with the media. You will be the chief spokesperson of the group. But in addition, I want you to do two other things. I said, what are these? And he said, I'd like you to be the chief ethics officer of the group, because so much of the Tata brand has been built on our reputation for good corporate governance and the fact that we have a code of conduct which the entire group is supposed to subscribe to. So as chief ethics officer, you will oversee that. Also, I want you to be the chair of our sustainability council, the new council we're going to create with the CEOs of the largest Tata companies. And that's because sustainability is also something that is deeply embedded in the Tata Group's culture. And at that point of time, this we're talking about late 2012-13, was also the time the Companies Act was getting amended. And if you recall, the new CSR provision was being brought in, which is going to make it a requirement for all companies that met a size and scale test to contribute 2% of the net profits to CSR. So corporate social responsibility or CSR is going to become a very important subject to be reported in annual reports. You need to have a CSR committee of the board with an independent director. It was all getting more formalized. And he wanted oversight of this whole space because Tata's around that time was spending probably around 600 crores a year on CSR. So he wanted somebody to oversee the way it is being spent and the broader agenda beyond CSR of how we adapted to sustainability, climate change, environmental issues, and so on. So for me, I mean, all these were new spaces. I'd never managed a brand apart from the role I'd played as managing director of one of our telecom companies. I'd never been a chief ethics officer. I hadn't overseen CSR or sustainability. So it was all very new and very fresh. So I said, sure, I'll take up the role and work with you as part of the Group Executive Council as the first brand custodian. So in that role, then, I really felt that as I got to understand better what was expected of me, and in terms of what I thought were opportunities ahead, a few things about leadership and brand custodianship, if you will. First, I think in every organization, you would ideally hope every person in the organization regards themselves as a brand custodian. There shouldn't be only one. And typically, it starts from the top. The leader of the organization has to be somebody who personifies the brand and what it stands for, the values of the organization, but then it has to cascade deep down to every individual. And as you would have seen in the book, I also make the point that, to my mind at least, and this is something consistently through my career I've advocated, including the telecom company or the private equity business, every individual is a leader in some form or fashion. We all have responsibilities. We are leaders in the home front. We may be leaders in a nonprofit. We may have some passion where we're showing leadership on the basis of some skills that we may have. Each one of us has leadership capability. So you can't say that, X or Y is not cut out to be a brand custodian or is not cut out to be a leader. I think the two go hand in hand. So then the question was, how do you actually cascade the sense of ownership of the Tata brand? And there, as I mentioned in the book, there were a number of initiatives we took. But what probably I'm proudest of, we did a lot of work on the code of conduct and communication. But I think what made the biggest impact for me personally was a volunteering program. I think giving every Tata employee the opportunity to volunteer on company time, pursue a passion that they felt strongly about in the social space, and to support nonprofits that were trying to do good work in those spaces. I think that gave me a lot of satisfaction. It was a new program for the Tata Group. We launched it on the 175th birth anniversary of our founder, Jamsetji Tata. And very quickly, we signed up over 100,000 volunteers, delivering, well over 1 million hours of volunteering a year. So it's become, I think, India's largest corporate volunteering program. And the reason I thought it was very important for us goes back to the core purpose and mission of the Tata Group, which has gone through various evolutions, but by and large, it stood the test of time. Today, the core purpose of the group is defined as improving the quality of life of the communities it serves through long-term stakeholder value creation based on leadership and trust. So this idea of improving the quality of life of communities, I felt was something, if it is spoke to the heart of the brand, who we are and what we stand for, you need to give each individual the opportunity to experience for themselves what it means to improve the quality of life. And the best way to do that is send them out in the community and let them explore their passions. So that, I think, was very important initiative for the Tata Group, and something that gave me a great deal of satisfaction. But the larger point about leadership and brand custodianship, inevitably, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about that in the course of the next hour, it starts at the top. Leadership at the top has to demonstrate and live the values. If you don't see that happening, if there isn't an authenticity to it, people very quickly can figure out what's a fake. And then those are the organizations where very quickly things sort of unravel, and people down the line start taking their cues and taking shortcuts, and you have ways in which the laws get violated, and some of the biggest organizations have taken a hit and gone down very fast when the leadership at the top hasn't really walked the talk and lived the values.
Beautiful. So many insights in just one response. So thank you, Mukund, for that. This leads me to a very beautiful aspect. You spoke about the human centricity of the Tatas. You spoke about the opportunity Tatas provided for volunteering. And it's a huge number. 100,000 people is not a small number who volunteered to be part of it. And that's not an easy journey. So given all of this, in the digitalized world, how is such a large conglomerate organization like the Tatas able to still manage the element of human centricity and trusted leadership?
So I think digitization provides opportunities. I mean, any technology opens up new vistas, new ways of experiencing a brand, new ways of communicating with your workforce. And when you're a very international group like TATAs, where maybe a third of their workforce is outside the country, I think these tools become very useful in having the leadership staying connected with people in the most remote locations. So that there is an opportunity, there is an advantage there. Having said that, I think for each company, each brand, each culture, if you will, the kind of values it represents, digitization will also present significant challenges. And I think in my book, I talk about the fact that if you take the last maybe 20 years, the most successful Tata organization in the group has been Tata Consultancy Services, a company squarely in the center of the digital revolution. Today, they in fact account for over 50% of the Tata workforce. They have over 400,000 employees. But what is also happening, which is cause for concern, is in other companies which aren't as mainstream digitalized, if you will. A lot of our companies in the manufacturing space, for instance, and even in a space like telecoms, we've had to actually shed a large number of people. So to the extent the brand stood for a group that really was creating jobs in sectors of national economic importance, doing a lot to support the manufacturing agenda. Make in India that we talk about now was something that Tatas were doing 100 years back, whether it was in steel or in power and so on. A lot of that now is under pressure because of digitization, because of automation, because of robotics. Machines are taking control of a lot of these operations. So I think in that kind of scenario, there is a lot of soul searching that groups like Tata's will have to do about where do you take the business, where do you take the brand, how strongly do you feel about your values, will you make certain compromises or accept certain trade-offs if you want to stay true to some of your earlier the symbols that represented your brand very strongly, like job creation, for instance. I think difficult challenges ahead. So digitization is not a uniformly beneficial and supportive framework in which you operate. It can also present challenges that go to the heart of who you are and what you stand for.
Absolutely. So in terms of soul searching, which is such a beautiful terminology that you brought into the conversation, you also indicate in your book that leaders have to act the role. And this ties in so beautifully with the soul searching that leaders have to do when they play the role of a leader. And it also brings in another aspect of leader being self-aware to be able to play the role itself. So what are your perspectives on this, Mukund?
I think the greatest leaders are those, again, a bit similar to the greatest brands that have an authenticity to them. So people, like I was saying earlier, can sniff a fake often a mile away, but sometimes it takes them a little longer to figure it out. But usually it's very hard to, as Lincoln said, fool all the people all the time. So you have to have intrinsic qualities. And particularly in an organization, if you claim to represent the best of the values the organization has and holds dear, you need to, in a sense, live the values. You need to walk the talk. Having said that, I think let's also accept, and I make the point in my book, that very often in India particularly, there's a lot of hero worship that happens. We tend to put people on pedestals. And invariably, too often at least, we've seen that many of them have had feet of clay. And then you become very disappointed. We've seen it in sports, we've seen it in Bollywood. People you looked up to suddenly turn out to have, problems, eccentricities, angularities, severe personality issues sometimes. So maybe it's also a problem of expecting too much from our leaders. So I go back to the point I made that, look, we're all in communities, different kinds of communities and organizations. Each of us also has a responsibility, and each of us has a capacity to demonstrate leadership. And increasingly, I think in the future, given the amount of influence of technology, the amount of information, no person is going to be able to master all the ways in which organizations are going to get impacted. You don't know where the next situation is going to come at you from. Right now, in the midst of COVID, we've already seen the big buzzword is now resilience. Can companies demonstrate resilience to see through these kinds of black swan events? So you are going to have to rely and depend on lots of people. And I think it's people coming together that really affords solutions to be found in these crises. And for that, again, a leader is to be somebody who acknowledges that they don't have all the answers, is willing to look out for support, for help when they need it, and sometimes to encourage people to speak up. And they do that when they know that the leader is honest, is authentic, is telling us the situation as it is asking for help and solutions, and we are all in this together. I think leaders who try and pretend that they have all the answers, the my way or the highway kind of leaders, are often the ones who take their followers on a journey which often ends in disaster. Maybe one of the great examples of the 20th century was Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. You had one man who claimed he had all the answers, and people followed, and look where it landed that country in the Second World War. So I think leaders have to obviously have certain capabilities and demonstrate attachment to certain values that their followers hopefully hold dear, think is worth following them for, sometimes worth fighting for. And that's when you get alignment and delivery over time. But we should also be careful not to expect too much also, particularly in today's world where there's so much out there that no human being will be able to master or grasp all the time.
So that brings us, you indicated beautifully about the vulnerability a leader needs to have, particularly when he does not know things and if he has to lead. Which brings me to the next question, which is around, how important was being candid and honest in conversations with senior leaders in such a large group like the TATAs, where every day and every day out, I'm sure you would have faced multiple and very different challenges. So what was your experience of being there and seen it all?
I think it was critical. Again, it goes back to the values that you espouse as a group. And if integrity, for instance, is a core value, which it is in TATAs, there is no option but to be transparent, to be candid, to be open with people. Having said that, you have to be also, if you're the person in the hot seat, you have to be diplomatic, because excessive candor can sometimes be a little demotivating and demoralizing. The whole point about encouraging people to do better is not necessarily to, throw the book at them and say they are performing lousily. You want to give them excitement, encouragement of the future. So you have to be a bit of a diplomat as a leader also. But, let me say two things. One is, I think perhaps the greatest icon India ever produced, which I talk about in the book, Mahatma Gandhi. If you read his story of My Experiments with Truth, essentially his autobiography, you see a leader who's willing to acknowledge all the frailties, all the issues that they face, the learnings they've had on their journey. And it's so refreshing, because rarely do you find leaders actually willing to acknowledge any defects in their personality or their mental makeup or mistakes that they may have made in their career and so on. So the father of the nation, if he could be so open about himself, there's so much to learn from that. In TATAs, I think the greatest example, and I think I have an entire chapter devoted to that in the book, was the situation we faced with Tata Finance, a company in the financial services space that, thanks to certain violations of the law, led by a leader who used to be at one time very, very close to our then chairman, Ratan Tata, a gentleman called Dilip Pendse. Unfortunately, it took a tumble and eventually we had to close down the company. There were many occasions in maybe 3-year period, starting in 2002, when we discovered a scandal in the company, all the way through for the next 3 years till we probably closed the company down, when we had many choices to make in terms of not making full disclosure of the problem to the regulatory authorities, to people like the Securities Exchange Board of India, the Reserve Bank of India, not filing criminal cases against some of the managers involved, who'd all been intimately involved in the group's growth. Some of them were friends of Mr. Tata and others. So we had many options to go easy and to, in some ways, brush things under the carpet. And many other companies in our position would probably have done the same. But at that time, and I mentioned in my book that I think I have the greatest respect for Mr. Tata's actions at that time as leader of the group, he took a view that there is no question of burying all this and hiding it away from public view. We will be open, we will be candid, we'll be transparent. And if we have to take it on the chin in terms of the consequences and outcome, we will. Because if you cover up something like this, people will get the wrong message. They'll think in Tata's anything goes. You can violate the law, you can violate your code of conduct, it doesn't matter. And he said there's no question of that. And at several points, the affected parties sort of tried to throw a lot of mud. At one point, there were suggestions that some of Mr. Tata's relatives may have been involved in some form or fashion. And he actually told the people investigating that, look, I don't care if it's my brother or my sister, go after them. I think that level of commitment and demonstration of integrity, that I don't care where this is going to take us, but it's important that we get to the bottom of what has gone wrong. And there's no question of hiding things. We are still in court, by the way, on some of the cases we filed in 2002. Wow. So it's 18 years later, and we all know that in India, justice can often be delayed enormously long lengths of time. But the fact that we are willing to take that approach, I think, speaks volumes of the kind of group we were trying to be. We may not always succeed, but we did make a lot of mistakes also subsequently as well. But I think that particular episode was one of the finest moments when we said, nothing doing, this is not acceptable, and we will be open and transparent about it, even if it means a loss of reputation.
What a moment of pride I can see on your face as you are recalling those moments, and the deep admiration that you bring for Mr. Ratan Tata as you're talking. So that's so evident in this conversation, Mukund. So as a brand custodian of the Tatas for over 2 decades, I'm sure you would have also seen quite a few challenges leaders had to ensure that, they were safeguarding the brand. So would you like to elicit a couple of examples? Of course, one of it was just the one that you spoke about, but is there anything else that stand out to you while leaders, and not only in Tatas, anywhere, look to safeguard their brand?
I think you need to obviously ensure that everyone in your organization is, in a sense, singing from the same hymn book. If you have a view that your brand stands for certain values, you need to ensure that everyone is educated about those values in sufficient depth, has the right kinds of tools to be able to embrace those values. So in Tata's, for instance, the code of conduct is a very important instrument in explaining what are the expectations that Tatas have from their employees and what are the commitments we are making to all our stakeholders, including the environment and environmental protection. So you need to ensure that everyone is aligned and understands what is expected of them. And therefore, a huge role for communication. I think that's very critical. And sometimes you discover very interesting elements when you actually make the effort to reach out. I'll give you an example. When we were amending our code of conduct in 2015, we had some strong interactions with employees in Europe. In particular, we had some large plants and facilities in France and Germany. And one of the clauses we were introducing or rewording, if you will, in the code of conduct was around whistleblowing. Whistleblower policy had just been legislated in the Indian Parliament. It was a requirement under Indian law. And we just bunged it in thinking this is very easy to understand. Nobody would have a problem with it. And we were quite stupefied when the unions in France and Germany expressed objections. And it turned out that there was a context to their objections. The way the language was emerging in the whistleblower clause in our code of conduct suggested that we were inviting people to, in a sense, squeal on their colleagues if they saw somebody doing something. And it had too much of a resonance with their past experience, going back, in fact, to the Second World War, of informants, and the way there would be informants for the Nazis, for instance. The resistance in France, for instance, were seen as heroes after the World War, and the informants for the Gestapo were seen as, really villainous people who were treacherous to the core. Even after the war in Germany, East Germany, for instance, there was a sense that the informants for the Stasi, the secret police, were people who didn't necessarily have the best interests of the nation at heart. And after the German reunification, a lot of this got exposed, and some of the most high-profile people are seen to have been informants. So there was a context in which people thought whistleblowing in the context of being informers to a position of authority is not nice. It's not the way you build solidarity and good culture. But if you reworded it to explain that everyone is in this together if the organization takes a hit, and therefore what you're appealing to people is really to the best part of their personalities to report something that is odd or awkward or problematic, which could impact everyone's combined future, then it was acceptable. So, you wouldn't normally think of whistleblowing being an issue that anybody should take objection to. So it just brings me back to the point that communication is so critical. And sometimes we take things for granted without understanding the context in which people operate. So I think the best brands are those where really a strong effort has been made to create alignment on the strength of shared values. And a lot of effort is invested in communication. And you need to obviously provide the tools. You need to have the systems and processes in place to ensure that you're able to measure progress and address issues wherever you spot them from time to time.
Beautiful. So there's been a wide array of insights ranging from communication, inclusivity, where you consider every country, every geo, every individual outside of India. There's been a lot of conversation around authenticity of leaders, transparency, courage, resilience in tough times, all of this that stands so aligned to the TATAs. I'm sure that, in a large organization, again, there will be play of ego that comes irrespective of whether we like it or not. Power and ego go hand in hand. So how have you handled situations with leaders who come in with egos, or have you observed leaders with egos impacting the organization in some way?
Oh, I think all the time you see them all around you. Again, I think you need a certain amount of ego, and ego I'm defining as, a sense of maybe certainly a great deal of self-esteem, sometimes conceit, but equally a fairly robust self-confidence that the leader has, which is why the ego arises. And if you don't have that, it becomes difficult to lead because, usually it comes into play when there is some level of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And you need people who have the self-confidence that they have a way out of the status quo, that they can really introduce changes that they think are necessary to be able to lead the organization to better things, a better future. So I think it's unlikely you'll find a leader who doesn't have ego in some significant measure. But it can become problematic if it, as I said earlier, sort of dominates the personality and makes them reluctant to introspect, makes them unaccepting of the possibility that they don't know the answers fully, that they might need help from others. The unwillingness to concede that there are flaws in their own mental makeup, personality, knowledge, frankly, in today's world. There's so many things that each one of us would immediately accept we don't know. So leaders who think they are with all the answers and will brazen it out can actually lead you to destruction and to the end of countries even, as we saw in Hitler's case. So I think it's very important for ego to be managed. And At the same time, you need some of it if you have to have dissatisfaction with the status quo and create change. It's people who've been dissatisfied who are often the ones who've been most creative and have delivered some huge outcomes and very important results for humankind. So I think you need all kinds of personalities.
That was definitely a very thoughtful answer. So thank you for that, Mukund. This kind of also is pushing me to delve on a completely different question, which is around, when you are in a matrix structure with several reporting lines coming in play, how is it that you have navigated the organization? Because that's a quality in a leader that is not spoken about, but most required. So what are your thoughts and perspectives on that?
Well, first I have to admit that for a large part of my career, I typically had very few interfaces. I was very, very fortunate. There's this old sort of saying that people leave bosses and not companies. So I stayed in TATAs because of the people who were my bosses. I had the great privilege of working with Ratan Tata for 12 years, then Cyrus Mistry for 4 years. And in between, I was managing director and headed private equity. So I didn't have too many points of interface, fortunately. But having said that, certainly in some of the roles that I played, you had to reach out to large numbers of people. It was a networked organization. Tata Sons, the body I worked with for most of my career, was the apex holding company. But to get a lot of the work done, whether it was on brand or ethics, sustainability or CSR, you obviously had to reach out to a large number of people who worked in companies with very different reporting lines. I think, again, it goes back to showing people that you have a common mission, a common purpose. If you're able to demonstrate that adequately and people see that there is a shared interest in achieving the right outcomes, people will come together. And then a lot depends on the way in which you try and transact business or navigate to get to an outcome. Like I said, even in the code of conduct, we tried to reach out, including to the unions, including outside the country, to many of our employees. And people feel good when they think they are being included and being consulted. If you have too much of a hierarchical attitude, or because you have quote unquote power, you demand performance, people don't necessarily respond well. But when they see that there is a shared agenda, that everyone is going to benefit from it, adequate investments have been made in explanation and communication, then I think they're much more willing to give with their time, give with their talent, give with their skills. Same thing we saw in volunteering. So many people that volunteered the first time around. In fact, we had a kind of Stalinist era outcome to a survey we ran. We asked how many people would like to volunteer again. And I think 99.9% of the 100,000 people said absolutely yes. So I think when people feel that they're being given opportunity to deliver the best of what they have, their skills and talent, they feel that they're being valued and they want to do more. So I think any good organization would ensure that some of these buttons that can be pressed to achieve performance will receive the kind of attention and support. So it goes back to the tone at the top, the communication, the way in which you articulate the values, the tools and technologies you equip your people with to be able to subscribe to those. And then constant reiteration and encouragement. I think all that makes a difference.
Beautiful. The biggest insight in this conversation for me has been leadership by example, walking the talk. You spoke about integrity, just in black and white and not in gray at all. This leads me to my final question of this conversation. You've seen so much of a journey behind you, and you have several years of journey ahead of you. What is it that makes Mukund happy every single day?
I think what I really enjoy and have enjoyed now for the last couple of years after I left the umbrella of the Tata Group, where a lot gets done simply because you're part of the group, is the opportunity to be creative in different ways, almost on a daily basis. So I wrote the book that you mentioned, Brand Custodian. I'm working on 2 more books now. So every day I write a little bit, and that's very satisfying. I always have enjoyed writing. I didn't get that much time to do it when I was in TATAs. I'm also able to leverage a lot of my learnings and experience in TATAs with some of the businesses I'm now involved in. Most importantly, ESG platform we're creating at eCube Investment Advisors, which is really trying to help corporate India make the transition to better environment, social and governance practices. So there I'm able to put to work a lot of the gyan I gave you over the last hour and share sort of learnings, best practices from what I've seen in the past with companies that we're engaged with. So I think the ability to, find meaning in a lot of what you've done in the past, put it to work now, and the daily creativity of continuing to write, to express yourself. The conversation I'm having with you right now is again an opportunity to reach out to many more people and tell your story. I find all of that extremely satisfying, and that gives me, I think, a great deal of joy.
Wow. So Mukund, I saw in you a tremendous amount of authenticity. I saw in you a give back that you have worked on all your life, perhaps. I see in you a lot of hope for the future, and I really wish your ESG succeeds the way you imagine. And thank you for joining me today. And this definitely is going to be a very different conversation for the viewers. So thanks a ton, and I'll stay in touch. Stay well.
Absolutely. Very much look forward to that. Thank you so much for having me. All the very best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.